hammered it down into humanity's head that this is an illegal and massively bad plant.
But now, scientists are slowly discovering that its uses can go well beyond what we have known so far, and could help us clean up a lot of industries. A big one is construction. The building and housing industry produces almost 40% of all carbon dioxide emissions. But hemp might help change that. Hemp wool is already in use as an insulation material. But now, more and more sustainable construction companies use hempcrete to build walls and floors too, like this 12-floor building made with hempcrete in South Africa. Hempcrete is basically a mixture of hemp chives and lime. Lime petrifies the hemp so it doesn't degrade or break. It is light but strong. It is breathable, so it regulates moisture and temperature better. That means lower energy bills, no mold, and basically a non-toxic environment. It is fire resistant, and due to its flexibility it can withstand major earthquakes. Its insulation properties are also off the charts. It works as heat, sound, and humidity insulation. And after its lifetime, hempcrete can be reused as fertilizer, as it is totally organic. But hempcrete walls do not only produce less carbon than concrete ones, they are actually carbon negative. That means hempcrete stores more CO2 than it requires to make and transport. That is due to hemp's carbon storage capacity.
Hemp fiber insulation stores on a net base more than 50 kilograms of carbon dioxide per cubic meter of hemp insulation. For your reference, the production of glass wool or rock wool insulation emits over 250 kilograms of carbon dioxide.
But the obstacle is, in most countries, construction regulations are very strict, and introducing a new construction material can take years of testing and bureaucracy. Hemp is at the beginning of that road in many countries.
We need to give it a new chance and stop putting all these regulations on hemp. And we need to free this up entirely for the industries to really move forward. Because if 0.01% of THC are the little things that prevent somebody in the building industry to get chives or chives and herds for their building material, then this industry has no way of moving forward.
Hemp can also help to reduce deforestation. Until the late 19th century, most paper was made of hemp. Early Bibles and even the drafts of the US Declaration of Independence were written on hemp. But today, paper is made from trees, and it is one of the biggest drivers of deforestation. Every year we lose forests the size of Portugal. 15% of all trees we chop down are used to make paper. Global demand is expected to at least double, and in some cases almost triple. While we are losing our forests, some companies are more willing to reintroduce hemp into their paper production.
Textile industry is a little bit the holy grail, the Champions League for any fiber.
It's also a champion polluter, because cotton needs a lot of toxic pesticides and water. A hectare of hemp can produce 2.5 times more fiber than a hectare of cotton. It can grow up to 5 meters within just 3 to 5 months. Hemp fiber is not only better for the environment, but its strong fibers also make longer-lasting textiles. Less water, less fertilizer, less land and no pesticides, but stronger and lasting fibers. But there's a catch.
If you want to be successful implementing hemp fiber into the textile industry, we have to modify the hemp fiber to the existing textile machinery, because other way around is not going to happen, because the investments to do so are just too high.
Thanks to the pressures the textile industry has been facing, companies and researchers have been trying to find alternatives. Now, using enzymes or mechanical processes, they have found environmental ways to cottonize and integrate hemp fibers into their existing production. But this is still in the early stages, and it will take some time until the industry agrees on the best way to cottonize the hemp. This is the first problem hemp is facing in other industries too: lack of standard methods because of missing research and development for decades. Regulations are still confusing, and they change from country to country. These differences plus the fact that marijuana is still a controlled substance, scare off the investors. But against all odds, global industrial hemp demand was calculated to have a $4 billion market value in 2021 and is expected to reach almost $17 billion by 2030.
The many uses of marijuana. And that brings to an end this edition of Made, DW's business magazine. Until next time, take care.
Vibrant habitat and a glistening place of longing. The Mediterranean Sea. Its waters connect people of many cultures.
On to our next destination, Tunisia. Jafar Abdul Karim meets young entrepreneurs and visits the Jewish community on the island of Jerba.
In 90 minutes on DW. Every journey begins with the first step, and every language with the first word.
Hallo, ich bin Nico.
Nico is in Germany to learn German.
Was ist das?
Why not learn with him?
Ich habe nicht alles verstanden.
Du schaffst das.
It's simple, online, on your mobile, and free. DW's e-learning course, Nico's Weg. German made easy. They are eternal political dynamite and a pillar of state and society, a symbol of arbitrary rule, and a crucial tool in the struggle for justice. Taxes.
In many ways, I think taxation is one of the most extreme actions by a government, but it's also the definition of government, because without taxation, there's no government.
The right to levy taxes and the obligation to pay them, both inherent in the sovereignty of nation-states and their citizens. But what happens when the power of taxation is undermined?
A tax on top of the tax on top of the tax. That's the straw that broke the camel's back. I've been ranting forever, thinking to myself, when's it all gonna come crashing down?
Can't pay, won't pay. Taxation and Politics. Starts October 21st on DW.
This is DW News coming to you live from Berlin. Fresh attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. Missiles rain down on towns and cities across the country for a third day. Also coming up, NATO leaders gather in Brussels to consider the alliance's response to the latest attacks. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says strengthening Ukraine's air defenses is a top priority. Plus, the film world adds its voice and some graphic imagery through the protests over the death of a young woman held by Iran's so-called morality police. Hello, I'm Terry Martin. Thanks for joining us. More civilian targets have been destroyed in a third day of Russian drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. A strike on a crowded market has killed at least 7 people in the town of Avdiivka in the eastern Donetsk region. The governor says there's no military logic behind the attack. Earlier, I asked our correspondent in Kiev, Matthias Böllinger, what he knows about the deadly airstrike in the Donetsk region.
Yeah, we don't know exactly how it was carried out, but what we've seen is pictures on social media, horrific pictures of bodies lying next to market stands. This town, Avdiivka, is one of the towns where the line of confrontation, the line of contact came to a halt in 2014, 2015, and it's ever since been one of the frontline towns and has been frequently shelled since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February this year. The shelling has been stepped up all along this line, and all these places are under constant fire. It's no surprise that a place like a market has been hit because the shelling is pretty indiscriminate on civilian objects, on military objects, wherever these shells rain down, wherever they fall.
Now, we have seen these missile attacks across the country hitting numerous towns and cities over the past couple of days. Matthias, how are people in Kiev and elsewhere coping with that?
Well, life is more or less back to normal. People are a little bit more aware of possible strikes, more people going to take shelter at night, for example, when there are air raid alarms. But other than that, all the authorities, the organizations that are working on these kinds of things have been very quick to repair the damage, to patch, for example, holes in the roads and repair some of the damage done to buildings so that life can go on and traffic can move on. There's still problems with energy supply. We have power cuts now all across the city at different times in different parts of the city in order to ease a little bit the pressure on the power grid that has been damaged by these strikes.
The Zaporizhia nuclear plant, Matthias, has had its power supply interrupted again. Is the situation there at that nuclear plant under control now?
That's last info that we have. Yes, these power cuts are, of course, dangerous because although the power plant has been shut down, although these reactors do not produce electricity at the moment, the fuel that's inside needs constant cooling even when it's not active, when it's not to the point active that it produces electricity. It is still heating, and it needs to be cooled down, and the cooling systems rely on electricity. The power lines now are used to supply the cooling systems with electricity rather than exporting electricity from the plant or bringing out electricity from the plant. So this is a vital supply. There are generators that run these cooling systems when the power line is cut off, but of course generators rely on diesel supplies, etc., etc. So this is always a dangerous moment, and the fighting puts this plant under constant stress and under constant and puts it in constant danger of accidents.
Matthias, thank you very much. Our correspondent Matthias Böllinger there in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Moscow says it has detained 8 suspects connected to last week's explosion on the bridge connecting Russia and the occupied Crimean Peninsula. The security service says they include 5 Russians and 3 Ukrainians and Armenian citizens. Russia says they are suspected of carrying out a terrorist attack allegedly organized by Ukraine. Kyiv has not claimed responsibility for the blast and has called Moscow's investigation nonsense. DW's Kilian Baya in Riga has more details on those arrests.
The FSB has come out with very detailed plans of how this bomb allegedly came from Ukraine to Russia, traveling through Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, and then back into Russia. They said it was aboard a truck and it had been hidden inside of plastic construction wrapping, thick plastic material under which the explosives were hidden. Around 22 tons heavy the whole thing was, they said. They also said they arrested 2 more Ukrainian nationals of suspected terrorism. These 2 Ukrainian nationals, one of them had been carrying anti-aircraft weapons, and the other one explosives taken from an anti-tank bomb. This kind of fits in line of the narrative that the Russian state media is pushing and the Kremlin is pushing, claiming that the Ukrainian state is a terrorist state. And these arrests, these successes now kind of underline this narrative that the Kremlin is pushing. Now, we also need to remember that this bridge, the Crimean bridge, was of significant symbolic importance to President Putin. It was his pet project. President Putin brought Crimea back to the motherland, so to say, when it was illegally annexed in 2014. This bridge was the umbilical cord which was supposed to connect Crimea to Russia forever. And now the Ukrainians have proven that they can strike it, that they can damage it. In light of recent military defeats by the Russian military, pressure is mounting on the Kremlin and on the Russian Ministry of Defense. And this attack, of course, comes as another significant blow and bad timing.
NATO leaders are gathering in Brussels to discuss boosting Ukraine's anti-missile defenses. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the war has reached a pivotal moment. It's the first time NATO defense ministers have gathered since Russia illegally annexed several Ukrainian territories. At the same time, 50 countries are taking part in a forum set up by the United States to coordinate military aid for Kyiv. The U.S. Defense Secretary spoke of challenging months ahead.
Russia's latest barrage against Ukraine's cities has again killed and wounded innocent civilians and put targets with no military purpose in the crosshairs. We will continue to boost Ukraine's defensive capabilities for today's urgent needs and for the long haul.
DW's Terry Schultz is covering that meeting in Brussels. I asked her how much more military aid Ukraine can expect.
Yes, Terry, that's been a constant refrain from Kyiv since the war began. Weapons, weapons, weapons is what it wants from NATO allies. And today around the table, some 50 countries are meeting to discover exactly what they can give Ukraine, talking about who has what equipment. But as you mentioned, the priority today is going to be air defense, because as much progress as Ukrainian forces have made on the ground, without more complex air defense equipment, they can't do anything about these Russian attacks from the air. And everyone's been very struck by the loss of civilian life in these recent attacks that the NATO Secretary General described as horrific, indiscriminate attacks. So that's certainly going to be the priority here today. But in fact, what they're going to be providing Ukraine ranges all the way to winter clothing, how to deal with the months ahead. So certainly these 50-some countries are discussing what gaps they can help Ukraine fill as they look at Russia's re-energized attacks on Ukrainian cities across the country.
And of course, looming over all of this, Terry, is the nuclear question. How concerned is NATO and its partners that President Putin will make good on his nuclear threats?
Well, you always have to be concerned about the nuclear threat, but NATO has reiterated multiple times in recent days that they have not actually seen Moscow change its posture on nuclear weapons. And that means that they haven't seen any signs that they would actually be moving toward the use of nuclear weapons. At the same time, NATO has decided to go ahead with its annual nuclear deterrence exercises called Steadfast Noon. That's just an exercise that takes place every year where they practice dropping U.S.-supplied nuclear nuclear weapons, just in case. Just in case. This is used, of course, to remind Moscow that it is not the only one around here with nuclear weapons, while reminding the Kremlin that this is a war that cannot be won and should never be fought.
The Kremlin, Terry, today said that it considers NATO as fighting on Ukraine's side. Do leaders there in Brussels see it that way?
I think absolutely they say they're on Ukraine's side. Obviously, they are supplying the weapons that the Ukrainians are using to push back the Russians from the territory they've been occupying. Where NATO makes the distinction is that it is not fighting on Ukrainian territory. NATO has been very careful to keep its forces off of Ukraine's territory. They do not want to play into the Russian narrative that this is a fight between NATO and Russia, because that's how the Kremlin wants to portray this, to gin up support domestically among its citizens for fighting back against what Russia would call NATO forces. But I don't think anyone here would take issue with being on Ukraine's side. In fact, that is exactly what they're doing, and they say that they'll be there for as long as it takes.
Terry, thank you so much as always. DW's Terry Schultz there from the NATO Ministers' Defense meeting in Brussels. Israel says it has reached a historic agreement with neighboring Lebanon over their shared maritime border. The deal ends a years-long dispute and unlocks rich gas reserves. It's hoped it could improve ties between the two countries, which have technically been at war for more than 70 years.
The Karish gas field has been at the center of Israel and Lebanon's border dispute for years. But soon drilling ships like this one could move from just testing to actually pumping gas back to the Israeli coast. After the two neighbors seem to have finally reached a deal on their shared border. In a breakthrough that Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid said was historic and unprecedented. Lebanon's President Aoun has also welcomed the deal, which would pave the way for his cash-strapped country to begin natural gas exploration. Although following Israel into production would likely take years. In one Israeli coastal town close to the border with Lebanon, some people were supportive.
I think the deal between Israel and Lebanon is a good one that will bring peace. Sometimes it hurts to compromise, but compromise brings good for everyone.
But others worried who would benefit from Lebanese gas.
We all know that a lot of it, Hezbollah gonna have a lot of chunk of, they're gonna take the money, they're gonna have the commission, their cut, and they're gonna use it to get more rockets.
Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has voiced similar criticism, calling the deal an historic surrender to Hezbollah. And that could spell disaster for its future. With polls neck and neck in a general election just weeks away, Netanyahu has promised to cancel the deal if he returns to power.
Now to Iran, and the death of a young woman in the custody of Iran's so-called morality police last month has been fueling nationwide unrest as well as a wave of protest around the world. Support for the protests